So René, how did you get into punk rock and doing movies about punk rock?
When I first came to America, I'd done some features in Holland, and I kind of, in order to become more of an American, I checked in with Russ Meyer, the famous king of the nudies, whose work I admired a lot, and I became part of his little team. And there came a point when he had been in touch with some distributors in Chicago, and these people needed somebody to make a movie called Massacre at Central High. And they asked Russ, would he know somebody who could do it, right? And he said, yeah, I think I know a guy. He's like European, but you know, I worked on him. I took care of it. I think he can handle an American movie. So I flew over to Chicago, met these people, and basically they said, like, look, we've got this great title, Massacre at Central High. We want 8 kids to be killed in this high school, all right? So do you think you can take care of that? I said, like, well, you know, I come from a different culture and we don't do these things there in general. And we don't kill that many people in our movies. But yeah, now that I'm here, you know, like, why don't I give it a shot? Russ was pretty happy with it, and I'd made sure I had like an actress with very big breasts, and so everything was honky-dory, right? So, and then like all of a sudden Russ gets a call from Malcolm McLaren, whoever that was, and he is asked, like, is he interested in maybe making a movie as a sort of a sequel to Beyond the Valley of the Dolls? About a punk rock band. A punk rock band, I don't know what that is. So he gets in touch with me and says, like, look, I've got this stuff here, you check it out, I don't know what it's all about, right? So I listened to these cassettes, and it's interesting, okay. He says, all right, well, look, let me just dump this thing on you, all right? And you just figure it out what can be done here. So that's it, and the next thing I know, Malcolm McLaren moved in. My house became the headquarters of the Sex Pistols USA. They started to write a treatment, and Russ didn't like what he saw that much. He sent in Roger Ebert. So this thing became a complete camp bonanza, right? Like utterly campy. And in fact, there was nothing campy about the Sex Pistols, of course. So here were these kids who were like on the dole in England, totally socially engaged, and for that matter, claiming to be anarchists of some kind or another, etc. And like Russ didn't get the first thing about it. He would yell things all the time, like, "We saved your ass in World War II, you assholes! God damn it!" You know, like, and so on. And he just assumed that they just had to listen to him and Roger how to do this goddamn thing, right? And they were right in a way. He was right because let's be honest, they came to Russ Meyer, right? Malcolm McLaren came to Russ Meyer and said, like, make this movie. It was a complete mismatch. It was ridiculous. So then it wouldn't take that long, or the whole band was suffering from this LA syndrome. They were completely out of their elements here. And they went up to San Francisco for their first gig. And there it was like Bill Graham Presents and whatever. So you had this whole 60s hippie mafia there. And it was just bound to go wrong. So, and they never played again, right? That was the end of the Sex Pistols right there and then. So, okay, well, a lot of other things happened, which then ultimately led to Malcolm and I putting the pieces together a little bit, that eventually became the Great Rock and Roll Swindle. And by that time, everybody was moving on.
When was the first time you saw Screamers?
Brothers, I'll be down.
At one point I was introduced by Malcolm McLaren to Fayette Hauser, who was an ex-member of the Coquettes, which was a gender-bender, psychedelic glam glitter band in San Francisco in the 60s. And she told me there's a band in town you should really see, and that was the Screamers. So I remember clearly how we walked into this club, and it was very dark, and there was very stark lighting, just a few spotlights, and on the middle of the stage was a guy behind his keyboard. It was Tommy Gear staring darkly into the crowd, and like droning synth sounds coming from his instrument. And before long, this punk beat came in, which was like KK doing his thing. And then all of a sudden, Tomeda got onto the stage, and there he was. I mean, this absolute amazing phenomenon. Everybody was completely mesmerized, and it was really as if he was puppeteered from behind the keyboard by Tommy, who, I mean, like every pulse and every drone that would come out of his keyboard seemed to trigger Tomeda's jerky movements, his anguished expression, and ultimately even the electrified stand-up hair seemed to be triggered by that. And in fact, it seemed like a relationship between Tommy, the puppet master, and Tomeda, his puppet, right there on the stage. The theatricality, though, really appealed to me, and of course nobody could resist Tomeda. Tomeda was very genuine in the way he loved music, and he loved performers, and you see that later in all his artwork, where he pays tribute to everything that he was into. And I have to say that is actually not campy either. It transcends camp, because it is so genuine and so emotionally felt. But at the same time, Tomeda would go out of his way to just forever express how much he loved Michael Jackson, and so on and so on. So there, this whole sort of campy thing comes into play again.
Yeah, because he always talked about the Bay City Rollers and how great the Bay City Rollers were. Very strange.
Right. So and it was sort of genuine, but it all comes from that campy sensibility. And Tomeda, it was very clear, really wanted to go back to what he would probably consider much more his roots, and that's be a performer. Right. Like that's what he had always been.
So at that point, the Screamers weren't playing very often at the time that they met you and you started working with them.
They were looking for all of them in a way were looking for a change, because they didn't quite fit into. We just talked about it. It was not really a musical act. It was not truly a punk rock act. It was not truly a performance act in the way that Tomeda had been performing in the past in San Francisco and so on. So in a way, like, they were great, people loved them, but also from an identity perspective, it was not entirely clear what they were destined to be, let's just say. Yeah? So they found it a very good opportunity to come closer to a filmmaker, right? And I, on my end, still sort of baffled by everything that had been happening with the Sex Pistols and with Russ and whatever, and of course being very deeply engaged with music. I thought, okay, well, maybe we can do something here that is different. And I felt at that point in time that inevitably there was going to be something what later would be called music videos. And this was like a few years before MTV. And it seemed like right to steer this thing more into a music video type direction. But the problem is that it didn't exist as a medium. So the only venue for it was like live shows. So we made a few videos just instead of opening acts. That was actually our idea. No more opening acts. Very Screamers. No more opening acts, because they don't fit what we do anyhow. We are so special that. But of course, like my background being feature films, it seemed like that it would be a good idea to make something more narrative. And then we started to make or plan for a movie that was called Mensch, was the work title. And I got some people to back us up. And before you know, we actually had a great soundstage on Melrose. And in that soundstage, we built a recording studio. KK and Carl Strauken, almost like between the two of them, built the whole thing. We got ourselves like a monstrous old Hollywood crane for scrap metal prices, etc. And now we actually had a multimedia studio, and this is where we're going to make a movie. Now, I don't know too much about this early Mensch movie anymore. I know it was sort of about a disco Caligari, I think we called it, or whatever. It was about a German expressionistic sort of disco in a post-apocalyptic time where nobody could escape. And we started to shoot pieces of it, and everything functioned actually quite well. And we had about a third of the movie was shot or whatever, and the financier pulled out. So now we were sitting there, we had a few music videos, we had part of this German expressionistic movie, and what's next? It happened from the beginning on a deeper level, when you just take all the personal friction away, is that the whole thing was really a support system for Tomeda, right? Tomeda was this endearing, demented character that everybody had to somehow fall in love with, and everything was there to just boost him and to support him and so on, to do his shenanigans, right? And even though Tommy may not have seen it that way, he was part of it, very much part of that support system. He came up with a kind of music that the unmusical, the amusical Tomeda could respond to. And now we added to that support system in a major way. Because all of a sudden, okay, there was my own considerable support that I had thrown their way. And then there was David Campbell, the father of Beck, who was very, very modest about how yes or no to contribute to things on a musical level, typically like an arranger. So he would not overstep the boundaries that they set per se, but phenomenally gifted. And he got recording engineers involved who were extremely good, etc. So there were musicians from left and right that we could involve, like Steve Berlin, many others who contributed to it all. And later on, when we started to make the videos, there were cameramen. If I just tell you who the cameramen were that I brought in there, there was like when you see Population 1, there's Oliver Wood, who would go on to, for example, do the Bourne trilogy, right? There was Jan de Bont, who would go on to direct Speed and Twister. There was Bill Pope, who would go on to shoot all the Matrix movies. So, I mean, the level of support, of talent, at that time these people were not famous, but the level of talent that was brought into that to carry all of this was phenomenal. So even without the financial support, after the financier had pulled out, we still managed to go on for quite a while. And we decided, like, well, we can't just finish a movie just like this. So let's just focus on one more performance.
Then everything fell into place. Live shows, videos, singing, dancing, eating and drinking, a place to hoot and holler and stomp your feet, and everything going all at the same time. So if you come to our show, we can be happy again together.
And by this time, a lot of things had changed. Like the band was not nearly as much of a band anymore. Then, like Tomeda had also somehow changed in the process, and that's something that we only understood later on. But Tomeda was one of the early HIV patients, and it took him a long time to finally even figure that out, frankly, because again, none of the cast of characters I'm talking about could go to a doctor in America. And that coincided with this whole energy level of him going down quite a bit. And we decided that in order to just like boost the energy, we would bring somebody else in, and that was Sheila. And she, of course, had more of a sort of a punk rock attitude, a proper drunk with an amazing voice. So basically we just cobbled together this show, which was highly theatrical, and that was the show that played in the Whiskey, the Roxy, New York, and so on. And so we accrued more and more material, and then the point came like, okay, so what are we going to do next?
You were in deep on you were helping them out.
Right.
You were doing everything you could to help them out.
Well, very, very true what you're saying, because in essence, like, I had so much vested into it all that what could I do, right? So anyway, the next step was like, well, then we have to probably go back to a more narrative method to just like pull ourselves up by the bootstraps here. So why don't I take all that stuff and I just craft some sort of a narrative out of it, right? Now, of course, video was maturing. And chroma key, the first examples of chroma key were visible here and there. So basically just this blue screen compositing elements together. And this intrigued me a great deal, being sort of a pioneer by nature, certainly when it comes to audiovisual things. I figured like, well, when I just can composite everything together and so on, then maybe I can like in a much cleverer way deal with all this material and the musicality of it and so on and so on. So, and I found out that there's one place where I could do this to some extent, and it was in Woodstock at Todd Rundgren's studio. So along with Bianca, my wife, we packed up an old Volvo, drove across country, ended up in the studio of Todd Rundgren, and there was this one engineer like us, sort of completely ready to go out on a limb. And we started to involve people everywhere, all over New York City and so on, to just push the envelope on how to make these chroma keys. And we were the first ever to make the best chroma keys in some ways, certainly at the time, because we went film to videotape. So it was 2 layers. So your main layer was film, blue screen, and then like key the video into that. And it's kind of very interesting to now look at Population 1, because it is a total chroma key freak out, right? It's just ridiculous. I mean, that's what the movie is about as much as anything else, right? And in this day and age, of course, that's always the problem when you pioneer these things. Like, to make a key is nothing, right? You can do it on any laptop. So I'm very curious if anybody who sees this DVD will understand how that was hard work. But of course, from a narrative standpoint, we were getting further and further from home, because I had now, for financial reasons partially, I had like veered away from making a feature film towards like doing something that was closer to what everybody needed to keep going with such adventures, a record deal, right? So we made a bunch more videos, we just kept on going, such adventures, a record deal, right? So we made a bunch more videos, we just kept on going. And then there was one guy who had his own little record label, and he worked for Polygram in Chicago, and he had put out Per Ubu on that label. So I figured like, well, that is somebody that I might want to try out. So I get in touch with him, I fly to New York. And that was Cliff Bernstein, who would later on go on to become the manager of Metallica, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Madonna, Courtney Love, you name it, Tesla, whatever, all these bands. And he liked it. He thought it was very interesting. Of course, it was not music, and it was not. You could certainly not distribute it as such. But he liked all this video stuff because he was also like hip to the fact that there would eventually be this sort of like music video scene. This again was still before MTV. So he said like, well, yeah, you know, keep making these videos and so on. And then like this guy is obviously a great persona, etc. And then yeah, let's see, maybe we can do something, right? So we made a bunch more videos. We just kept on going. And then actually, like the first music video channel all of a sudden popped up in LA, and they showed our stuff, and this was like very, very promising, etc. And then I remember traveling across country or something, and then at one point I was stopping over in a motel in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I put on the TV, and there was MTV, right? Okay, now. What? It didn't feel good. It felt like we were the first to envision this kind of thing, and here it is, and it's big. It's going to be national, etc. And they're not going to want the screamers. Somehow that dawned right there and then.
Now you see it, now you don't. 'Cause I will grab a hold of it, twist it, bend it, make it fit, turn myself into a hit. Make this awesome image fit. Go!
How did it go from the narrative that you had of Minch into Population One? What became Population One in terms of narrative?
Well, it was all determined by practicalities, right? I mean, I needed the narrative, and one thing that was extremely attractive about Tomeda is that he was such an American person. You know, there was so much Americana around him. And I thought, like, well, we can maybe make use of that, because no matter what, this was going to have to be a vehicle about Tomeda, clearly. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So we had him. He was the constant that would put it all together. So this Americana thing, nevertheless, rubbed off. And then I figured out, like, well, what if we make this a revisionist story of America? So it's basically a revisionist history of the United States. So Tomeda, we had already all this stuff in this sort of disco Caligari, whatever it was, right, from Mensch. So we called that the bomb shelter. We put Tomeda in that bomb shelter, and we can even use some stuff from Mensch that will look like there was a backstory there. And he is the last man on earth. Why not, right? So, and of course, like it immediately gave this ironic twist, because now we could have Tomeda express his deep love for America, while America is gone. All right. So that's basically the angle that I figured out how to do this thing. And then, as much as I possibly could, I made this Mensch thing the backstory. And then some of the music videos that we did were all sort of more flashback-like, and also all of it told from this perspective of this America's population of just one. All right, so now we had sort of like a framework to continue with the movie, and to hopefully make it possible to fit all the pieces that we had shot over time and that sort of didn't quite hang together, to bring them together into a storyline after all. But we had no more money, first of all, and secondly, like, we now no longer had the studio either. Like, unfortunately, the former financier had sort of like conspired with the landlord to have us kicked out of the place that we had built with so much effort, and had turned into a great studio, and now, you know, it was going to be dismantled, and that was the end. So how to do this? Well, the answer came in the form of Tomeda's apartment. He was living in some grimy building off of Hollywood Boulevard with a boyfriend who actually was like a 9-to-5 guy. and we convinced him to let us like turn that apartment into that bomb shelter. So we moved in, and it didn't take long, or KK had turned the place into this very bleak bunker, and we started to sort of piece the whole story together as we went. So every weekend we would come there, basically a small crew, KK I guess, Joe Kaufman, Karel Struiken, Jörg Walter, the cameraman, myself. I think that was probably it. And we would just like piece it together and shoot some stuff that often we just sort of wrote the night before. Sometimes like Tomato came up with something, sometimes I did, sometimes we were together. And this went on and on and on and on. As a matter of fact, to be quite honest, it's embarrassing to say, but it took a year. So basically, Tomato and his boyfriend lived for an entire year in this bomb shelter, in this completely fucked up apartment, with really no part of life whatsoever. It was a joke. You could hardly get into the bathroom because there was a set built in front of it. You could hardly get into a kitchen. I don't even remember that there was a kitchen anymore. It was completely hidden. So it was really a place that forced these guys to live there like as if they were the last survivors on Earth. I remember a few moments very, very clearly. At one point in the film, like all the objects of the apartment, or of the bunker, I should say, start to move about. And in this day and age, you would, of course, do that digitally. But that didn't exist back then. So what happened there was that Karel Struiken, who's the giant who would become the Lurch, had this huge pole, this fish line hanging onto it, and onto that fish line, like a hair dryer and a shaver and a mirror and whatever were glued, and that was used to sort of create this animated effect of all these appliances grooming Tomato for like a presidential speech. I mean, it was a rather pathetic situation. But the inventiveness of what Karel was doing there, for example, has always been like exemplary for all the stuff that we somehow concocted and could get away with. And then there were, of course, blue screens where later on we would key in all the audiovisual Americana sections of a story.
So out of all this chaos, a great country came to be. Since Roebuck and Barboya chased the face of the prairie, and many other pioneers raised a family. Kids born to be Americans, the last of whom is me.
I have always deeply admired the way Tomato saw America, you know, the way Tomato saw the Greyhound bus, the way Tomato looked at art in a country that is sort of destitute of art, where there's no support for that. So he would make art out of nothing, right? And he would be this strange, humble hobo who would like move to New Orleans and then make enough artwork so he could just hitch a ride on a bus to LA and then sell these things for $25 a piece, and he would break even. This would be great. He couldn't pay any health care bills or whatever, you know. Like, I mean, of course, the poverty was at the same time, when you really look into it, sort of heart-wrenching in a way. And he had that in common with other people in the movie. For one, there was Al Hansen, and he was the father-in-law of David Campbell, and later on would become the big role model of Beck again. And Al was another one of those strange, scrappy artists who had no money ever, right? And he would somehow sort of get by, live on the refills at the coffee shop, and basically make art out of cigarette butts, right? For example, always the cheapest materials he could possibly find. He had done some really interesting things with the Fluxus movement, and actually, in retrospect, was quite important. But he was a bit of a tramp, a bit out of his element here in LA, and he was here because his daughter lived here. But he loved the Screamers and Tomato in particular, of course. And again, it was such an American figure. It was unbelievable. And he would always do the same thing. I mean, Tomato would go into a coffee shop and he would make his tomato soup from ketchup and some hot water that he could get for free, right? And Al, like again, he just would always go for a refill after refill after refill, and with lots of sugar in it to keep the energy going, etc., right? And Al's been broke his entire life, by the way. He's lived pretty much dirt poor. He moved to Germany ultimately, and it's an amazing story. That strange American optimism against all possible odds, right? Now, our neighbor was a woman who lived in a shack in the parking lot, and she hobbled. One of her legs didn't work properly anymore, and her teeth were like all completely screwed up, and so on. But she had an interesting vibe about her. And of course, Tomato found out who she was. It was Vampira. So now we had this other phenomenal Americana figure there. Vampira, of course, had sort of a Hollywood career. She had come to Hollywood in the early days, knew Marlon Brando and James Dean and I think Marilyn Monroe, what have you, right? And she sort of like took off, and then like after a while she married a guy who was the writer of 3 of the classic Clint Eastwood movies, Dirty Harry and some others. And somehow things went wrong, and she ended up living like destitute in that shack on our parking lot. So the idea was born to bring her into the desert where she would act out the part of Tomato's mother, right? So that was Vampira. So and to me, all these 3 characters have this one thing in common that has made an incredible impression on me. They all lived on nothing. They all like completely went on doing what they needed to do. They never were bitter at all. And they never, ever gave up for even one moment to engage in their art, right? Now, those 3 people are just, to me, those are the consummate artists. I mean, that is just unbelievable. I mean, that's worth the documentary right there. And what's very interesting to me about Tomato, too, that everybody overlooks, Tomato was also older, not like Al, but Tomato was at least 10 years older than everybody else on the scene. So that whole punk scene had actually this 60s, more or less hippie kind of guy coming from San Francisco, glitter rock, whatever, in their midst. And nobody ever asked any questions about that. But it reflects a lot on Tomato, because that was what made Tomato ultimately the most interesting guy you could think of, and it has nothing to do. Now we are way beyond the Coquettes and the Screamers and all of that. He's like just this grown-up Huckleberry Finn, and nevertheless, that guy, that same Huckleberry Finn, that same hiya.
I'm Tomato do plenty.
That same, like the guy who uses this American vernacular to the hilt and so on. That's the guy who inspired Iggy Pop, who inspired David Byrne, who inspired Mark Mothersbaugh, who inspired Jello Biafra, etc. So basically, Tomato inspired all these punk rockers and whatever. But he himself was not only of another generation, but also ultimately of a whole different mentality. So it's very complex, and through this whole story, besides Population One, runs like a lot of cultural history that goes from the 50s all the way to like the millennium, just about, right?
Screamers are really interesting because, I think that they were universally very, very looked up to in the scene because they were doing something that was so stark and starkly different from the rest of what people considered punk rock. It was something so unique, strange, different.
Well, it's funny because we just listed all the characters that Tomato influenced, and to this day you have to say nobody can hold a candle to him, you know.
Yeah.
Even when like half his energy has dissipated and so on, it's still just there's moments where like that face. It's just an amazing character.
Amazing. Yeah. There's never been a front person like him. He's far out.
Let us see how you'll survive. Give us some action, give us some drive. Get at it, fight, press on, pursue. Take action, aggression, charge ahead and break through. Dance into the music beat. There's only victory or defeat. Get at it, fight, press on, pursue. Take action, aggression, charge ahead and break through. Let us see how you'll survive. Give us some action, give us some drive. Get at it, fight, press on, pursue. Take action, aggression, charge ahead and break through. Let us see how you'll survive. Give us some action, give us some drive. Get at it, fight. Give the future a break tonight. Thank you.